Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Wayne Coffey, the author of They Said It Couldn't Be Done, the 69 Mets, New York City, and the most astounding season in baseball history. He's written many books, longtime writer for the New York Daily News. Mr. Coffey, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Evan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for doing this. Before we start, I do want to invite our listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. So, who wants a distraction from politics? Who wants to talk miracles, a city overcome with joy, and the greatest sport in the world, baseball? The reason I love this book, and there are many of them, but it's because it's about my favorite team, the New York Mets. And even though I grew up on stories from my dad of the 69 Miracle Mets, which is what this book is about, and I certainly know the story of the 86 Mets backwards and forwards, I didn't get a full appreciation of how much this team meant, not just to him, to my dad, but to New York and the rest of the world until I read it in book form. So, Wayne, first of all, why is baseball the perfect distraction from politics?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Do we have like 24 hours or so? I think there's no, to me, there's no sport that sustains tension and drama the way baseball does, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's no clock. I mean, even the ALCS and NLCS games that are going on right now, I was watching them last night, and I was just completely riveted by, the fact, the drama, the tension, the strategy.
Isn't it funny how you lose track of time?
There's really nothing like baseball, and it is certainly a welcome respite because it just seems like I think we can all agree we're ready for 2020 to be over, and hope that 2021 might bring some better times where we maybe even don't even have to wear masks.
And on the baseball field, we usually don't have to think about that stuff, but I guess these days you do because just of how much the game has changed in the COVID era. But the Mets, if you say the name today to even to fans of the team, sometimes you get eye rolls and they go, oh boy, the New York Mets. I've lived my whole life of getting those eye rolls. What did you get, though, if you said the name of the New York Mets to someone in 1968?
The Mets, of course, were born in 1962, and they were sort of meant to fill the kind of the aching hearts of New Yorkers who love baseball and who saw the Dodgers and Giants leave for the West Coast in the late 50s. And so the Mets were really the stepchild of that heartache. But from 62 through 68, I mean, they were a historically pathetic team. They were a laughingstock, and their first year right out of the chute, they went 40 and 120. I mean, that is hard to do, to go 40 and 120. And the Mets did it, and they got only marginally better. And yet they were just beloved. It almost didn't matter what they did. But, so heading into 1969, a really difficult and roiling time in this country and in New York City, there was this, the Mets all of a sudden, out of nowhere, 100-1 shots became respectable and became a really almost a season-long joyride. And it really transported people to a different place and a magical place.
Part of this book is about baseball's relationship with New York City. So what was happening in the city away from the baseball fields when the 69 season gets underway?
Well, there was just tremendous social upheaval. There were labor strikes. A deeply unpopular mayor who was, basically feuding with anyone and everyone. There was a teacher strike. There was a there was a sanitation strike. There were, all kinds of unrest, even by New York City standards. And I think baseball became in a lot of ways, a respite for people who were just tired of dealing with the battles and the turbulence that was going on all around the city.
There are two characters that we need to describe. There's certainly characters that are titans that have become titans in Mets history, Gil Hodges and Tom Seaver. Who are they, and what do they think of the expectations that had been set for the Mets in 1969? The team starts out 18-18, and one of those guys, Tom Seaver, says,
everyone made a big fuss about it because the Mets, the historically horrible New York Mets, had never been a 500 team so late in a season. It was the middle of May. They were in Cincinnati, and the writers were making this huge deal. We're 18-18. Wow, the Mets are actually officially mediocre. Let's have a parade. And when they went to Seaver, the reporters went to Seaver for a comment. He basically said, we're not here to be mediocre. There's nothing absolutely to celebrate about being 18-18. And really that kind of put Seaver's stamp, the face of the franchise, Tom Terrific, as he was called. And he really, Evan, he was the game changer from the moment that he arrived. Seaver was in 1967. I mean, he was the embodiment of hope. He was boy wonder, with a beautiful wife and a handsome face and a just dazzling command of the art of pitching. And so when Seaver stepped on the field for the Mets, I mean, that almost conferred on them a legitimacy that they'd never had. And then a couple of years later, in a brilliant Cy Young season, he was the one. He and Jerry Koosman were the guys who really led the charge. And he was so on the field. Seaver was a game changer in every possible way and an attitude changer. But to me, the ultimate heroic figure in the '69 season was Gil Hodges. He was a man who really changed the whole course of the franchise. It did what I think really is the hardest thing to do for a manager in any sport to do, and that is change the culture of a team. And he did it with the quiet power and force of his personality. He was a great player with the Brooklyn Dodgers, but more than that, he was an immensely respected man who related to everyone well. Jackie and Rachel Robinson considered Gil and Joan Hodges some of their closest friends and the people who were the first to accept Jackie when he came to the Dodgers. And I think it speaks to what kind of man he was. Gil Hodges was a Hoosier from Indiana and a decorated war hero in World War II. And yet, he came to the Dodgers and settled in Marine Park, Brooklyn, and never left. And it was where he wanted to be. He had become a son of the city and a man who really embodied what the spirit and the passion and the belief that the 1969 Mets showed every day.
Yeah, I do want to say that, of course, I grew up in Shea Stadium and I saw his number, his retired number there up on the wall for my entire life. And I didn't appreciate how great of a manager he was until I read your book. I mean, of course, you knew he was great, but I guess part of me thought it was sort of, he died young. And I thought maybe it was just sort of, well, we're doing him a favor because he was the world championship manager to put his number up on the wall like that to retire his number. But until I read your book, I didn't realize. My dad said to me, yeah, it was like he batted .980 that year. Because every string that he pulled just worked out great. Speaking of Shea Stadium, it is my favorite place in the world, and it always will be. And I guess I should say it was my favorite place in the world. So describe, if you can, Shea Stadium, what it was like. Never mind just the '60s, but what it was like for its 40 some odd years of existence.
Well, it was a magical place for me, and I have such affection with it. I remember going to games with my grandfather there, and really, it, if you look at it objectively, it was kind of a soulless bowl of a ballpark with these little odd blue and orange speckles on the outside. Not sure what was going on there, but I mean, really, when you look at the latter day incarnations of ballparks, including Citi Field, which I think is just dazzlingly beautiful park, Shea had, it was this perfectly symmetrical bowl, and 341 down the line, 371, then 396, 410 to straightaway center. It didn't have a lot of charm, objectively speaking, but boy,
But we're not objective here.
No, we're not objective at all. I mean, I was there in Game 5 when they won, and I ran on the field with all the other lunatics, and got my little piece of Shea Stadium sod, and it was, it became, it was a magical place in a magical time, and what happened that summer. I mean, again, it's hard to overstate how completely improbable what the Mets did was. I mean, they had no chance. They had, they were 100-1 shot, and somehow this belief took hold, and then it unfurled. It started building like in midsummer. They had an 11-game winning streak in late May, early June. Then they had this epic series with the Cubs in July, and then but they were still behind, and the Cubs were, runaway favorites, and had this huge lead, and then the Mets just kept on coming and coming and coming, and it all happened in Shea Stadium, and it made for magic on a nightly basis.
It's my night, the nights that I remember there. I mean, I remember 100 of them, 1,000 of them. My dad, ticket holder since 1985, so I was at hundreds of games there. But I remember what it was like in the playoffs in '99 and 2000, and sitting in our seats in the mezzanine, the upper deck was absolutely bouncing on top of us. It was just the greatest. I could go on. We could do a whole podcast on Shea Stadium, but let's talk about some of the other characters on the team here. Who is on this team? How is it made up? What should we know about it in the context of where America is socially in 1969? And, I should say the Mets had white and black players. And one of the things you wrote is that Gil creates this clubhouse where all feel welcome. And some of them had not felt welcome growing up in the communities they grew up in. Ed Charles, Don Clendenin, Tommy Agee, they all have horrific stories of things that had happened to them. So talk about what these players experienced as they grew up, and some of them in the South, and how their stories of racism were completely common, and then how that all is brought together in the '69 Mets.
Well, it's easy to talk, in platitudes about how, we're all a team and we're all together. But the truth is that, there's a very deeply troubling and hideous strand of racism that runs all through American history. And the African-American Mets, Cleon Jones, Tommy Agee, Ed Charles, Don Clendenin, among them, were guys, as you said, men who lived with tremendous deprivation and hardship. In fact, Cleon Jones, to this day, lives in a little community in part of Mobile, Alabama, that is known to its residents as Africa Town. And it's called Africa Town because that is where the last slave ship, it made the trip illegally, but the last slave ship to come to the United States dropped its illicit human cargo, stopped on the west coast of Africa, brought these slaves, and under the cover of night went up the Mobile River and dropped them off to work on plantations. And there are ancestors from that ship, the Clotilda, who still live in Africa Town. And this is, it was a fiercely segregated world that Cleon Jones and his friend Tommy Agee, who lived in a nearby community in Mobile, and went to, and they lived in, and they, they went to, of course, schools were segregated. There was just, there were haves and have-nots, and there were, they were, unwelcome in every form or fashion you can possibly imagine. And And the fact that Cleon, to think about it now, Evan, really, like Cleon Jones and Tommy Agee shared an outfield for the same high school team in Mobile, Alabama. And they ended up being World Series heroes for the Mets in Flushing, Queens. I mean, what are the odds of that?
And Gil created a culture where even during this tremendously difficult time in America, there's a video of Tom Seaver grabbing Cleon Jones around his, with his arm around his head. It basically says, "This is one of my Bobos right here." It's a wonderful moment after the title had been won, but this is the culture that this team had, and they certainly don't win without that culture that they created.
No, he did. And again, it's, you can wish for this to happen and for players and teammates to respect each other and pull for each other, but it's much harder to accomplish. And I dare say in 1969, harder still. But, I think one of the key acquisitions that the general manager, Johnny Murphy, another really unsung hero of this story, was the trading deadline. Brought Don Clendenin to the Mets. They needed a big right-handed bat. They needed a first baseman, but more than that, he was a huge clubhouse presence, just sort of a galvanizing force. And it didn't matter what color you were, and that is what they really preached. I mean, when in talking to guys like Clendenin and Tommy Agee have passed, but talking to Cleon Jones and talking to Ed Charles before his passing a couple of years ago, I mean, they made it unmistakably clear that this, and every single person on the team said this, Evan, this never would have happened without Gil Hodges. Gil Hodges was the glue. He was the one who brought it all together, who basically set this standards and made everyone. This is the other thing that I think really managerial geniuses in whatever field have, is they make every person feel valuable, and even to the lowest rookie, to the backup catcher, Duffy Dyer. Duffy Dyer told me there wasn't one day where Gil Hodges didn't come by and say something to him. I mean, he could go 3 weeks without playing. Some managers wouldn't even know the guy's name. Gil Hodges would come by and say, "You know what? How you doing, Duffy? Stay ready. We're going to need you. We got to give Jerry Grody a rest. He made, it sounds almost hokey, but he made every single person feel valuable. I mean, one of the great heroes of that World Series was Al Weiss.
I was just going to say his name. I was just going to say
second baseman, the guy who couldn't
7 home runs in 10 years in baseball, right?
That's right. And he the guy was, he might have weighed 150 pounds, or not. They called him the Mighty Might, and yet, somehow, and he was the ultimate utility infielder, the spare part, a guy who, you just, is almost an afterthought for any other team. And yet, Gil would plug him in at second base or a shortstop. And this was a time when guys had to leave for military service. Yeah. A bunch of the Mets had to do. Bud Harrelson left. Ken Boswell left. So when they're off, they'd have to plug in Al Weiss to fill the holes. And boy, was he ever ready. So
unreal.
Gil had all these guys who felt important, who felt part of the whole. The best analogy I can think of is, if you take the sport of crew and you have people rowing, you've got 8 people in a boat and they've all got to be rowing in sync. And if one oar is out of sync, the boat's going to go haywire and it's not going to go well. And Hodges, again, created this culture where, all the oars were rowing in sync. All the oars, all 25 of them, felt like they were a really critical part of what the team was doing.
baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
July 9th is a day that every July 9th, Howie Rose talks about it. Every Mets broadcaster talks about it. But you mentioned it briefly here. Tom Seaver basically almost throws this perfect game. He gets to one out in the ninth, and he gives up a hit to basically a nobody. And
Jimmy Qualls is not a nobody in the Qualls family. I want you to know that.
That's a fair point. And I take that back. They love him very much. And I'm sure his mother was proud of that hit. But Seaver almost throws this perfect game. The Mets didn't have a no-hitter for another 50 years. And Seaver basically defines the regular season with this incredible moment. That's July 9th. Then the moon landing happens July 20th, 11 days later. Now, of course, they're not related. But are they? Did Mets players ever describe to you being inspired by that moment to play better baseball? Did landing on the moon make miracles more palatable here on Earth?
Well, I don't know if it made it more palatable, but here's the joke at the time was, people would say, well, the man will land on the moon before the Mets win the pennant. And, they both happened, won the World Series, I should say, and they both happened in the same year. So how about that? Maybe there's some kind of cosmic connection there, but it was that July 9th was indeed, I can remember where I was standing, to the square inch when that game was going on. And when Jimmy Qualls, damn him, with one out in the ninth inning.
You were there?
No, I wasn't there, but I was watching on TV.
Okay.
So, but I can remember I was at my next door neighbor's house. We were watching the game, and he hit a clean single to left center. There was no shot. There was no controversy. It was a clean hit. It was like, as Howie Rose described, it was like the air. 57,000 people were in the ballpark, and this hush, this groan, like this air, just came rushing out of the biggest balloon you could ever see, and it was just the most deflating, wretched letdown that just, it just felt like it was enveloping the whole earth. And Seaver standing on the mound with his hand on his hip, perfection was in his grasp, and he came up 2 batters short. But in that moment, and then people start cheering for Seaver.
And so the moon landing. So do the Mets start to believe because of this thing, or is it just two things and I'm being too much here in the divine intervention?
Well, I don't think that when they saw the man land on the moon, the Mets started thinking, hey, we really can do this. But it was certainly a huge symbolic import to the country. And what's hilarious to me, Evan, is that the day that when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, the Mets were stuck in Montreal because they had plane trouble. So the Mets couldn't get out of Montreal, and man landed on the moon. So I don't know. You tell me.
Right. Talk about the black cat. That's another big moment here. The quote you have in the book is, I saw the black cat come out of the stands and I knew we were in trouble. So who says that? Why do they say that? And how does this black cat become part of Mets lore as the regular season is winding down?
Yeah, so the black cat is the Mets had this epic series with the Cubs, and it was really a showdown for first place in early September. And the Cubs by this point they're on the run. The Mets were at the time right before Woodstock. It's another thing that happened this summer, Woodstock. Right. This is crazy. Like when the Mets were just as Woodstock was beginning in mid-August, and the Mets were, just hopelessly behind. I think 13 and a half games behind, and they had they looked like they were done, and everyone thought they were done. And then they finished the season going 38-11. I mean, talk about finishing strong. And so anyway, so the Mets are closing in on the Cubs. They're getting closer and closer and closer. And the Cubs come to Shea for the biggest series in the history of the Mets franchise. And early on in one of the games, like this black cat runs out on the field and goes right in front of the Cubs dugout, like having a stare down with Leo DeRocher, the Cubs manager. I mean, you can't make this up. And people later, they were all just like, we're awash in conspiracy theories today. Some people said that, there was the Mets like staged this. They had a groundskeeper release the cat. And, this, I talked to everyone who's still alive. This was not staged. There were a lot of stray cats in Shea Stadium for the best possible reason. There were a lot of rodents in Shea Stadium. So, they knew they could get some meals. In this series with the Cubs, the black cat comes out. And if that was not the, kind of the iconic symbol of, of the miracle that was unfolding. And the fact that the Cubs had a curse on them, so to say, this was confirmation of that. So,
one thing,
you can't make this stuff up. It looked like just when the other thing. There was one game after another that. It was like a season-long game of Ripley's Believe It or Not. Like you just could not believe the Mets in early September against the Pirates won a doubleheader, both games by the score of 1-0, both runs driven in by the starting pitcher. That's never happened in the history of baseball. And the Mets were a bad offensive team by any measure. What they did was they caught the ball and they had incredible pitching, and they were strong up the middle with Jerry Grody, Bud Harrelson, and Agee, and they made no mistakes. So, but they really couldn't hit worth much of a lick. So they'd sweep this doubleheader 1-0, and then in maybe the craziest game of all, they go in St. Louis and they face Steve Carlton, one of the great pitchers of his day. And Carlton sets a major league record, strikes out 19 Mets. And the Mets win 4-2 on two-run homers by Ron Swoboda. So,
another Hall of Famer.
The other two times Swoboda struck out. And after the game, Swoboda said, he got me twice, I got him twice. So,
But it's unbelievable. Before we talk about the World Series, let's just real quick that they play the Braves in the NLCS, and we don't have to go through each game or anything like that. But to talk about how Vietnam is looming during this and how that relates to Tom Seaver.
Oh yeah, well there were the anti-war protests were growing all summer, and by October of 1969, there was, in fact, on the day. The anniversary is in actually it's tomorrow of the game where there was a nationwide moratorium against the Vietnam War, and there were people, protesters who were outside Shea Stadium handing out leaflets. And Seaver had gone on record, even though Seaver was a former Marine. He didn't think the war was a good idea, and he was on record as being against it. And the protesters, the supporters of the anti-war movement, were all over this. And so Seaver's going out to pitch Game 4 of the World Series, and unbeknownst to him, his picture is on the cover of a leaflet being handed out outside Shea Stadium without his permission, basically saying, Tom Terrific thinks the war is a bad idea. Let's get out of Vietnam. And so that backtrack, he wasn't happy about that, but he he went out and won the one World Series game of his Hall of Fame career. And I should mention, I should have said it earlier, Evan. I mean, Tom Seaver, the Mets proverbial knight in shining armor, just recently passed.
Yeah, R.I.P. without a doubt.
Way too young, and in fact, it's been a brutal autumn for Hall of Fame ball players, from Bob Gibson, Lou Brock, now Joe Morgan, Tom Seaver,
Whitey Ford.
Just Whitey Ford. I mean, these were the baseball icons of my childhood, and in the span of weeks, they've all passed.
Yeah, my dad's feeling the same way. So they go and play the mighty Orioles here in the World Series. They beat the Braves. They beat Hank Aaron and the Braves. Now they got to beat the Robinsons and the Orioles. After the World Series is over, Seaver says they thought they were going to run us right off the field. The only way this happens is with several miracle plays. There are 2 by Agee, 1 by Swoboda. And you already mentioned some of the big hits that were gotten by guys who nobody may have heard of since then, unless you're a huge Mets fan. But talk about these miracle plays that happen, the 2 by Agee and 1 by Swoboda.
Yeah, I mean, Agee's plays, I mean, they were they both came in Game 3, and they had so the Mets lost. They lost the first game. Just to backtrack for a second, I mean, the Orioles were an overwhelming favorite. They had one of the greatest, really widely considered one of the greatest teams ever assembled. They were just phenomenal. I remember Earl Weaver said beforehand the Mets had won 100 games, and everyone, when Earl Weaver was asked about about the miracle Mets and whether he thought like God was on the Mets side, well, he said something to the effect that, well, God must like the Orioles too, because we won 108 games, and they had the Robinsons, Frank and Brooks, both Hall of Famers. They had a former Met who was an all-star center fielder in Paul Blair. They had Boog Powell at first. They had one of the great shortstops in the game, Mark Belanger, Davey Johnson, the future Met manager, at second base. I mean, they had stars all over the place in one of the greatest rotations in the game. So Tom Seaver starts Game 1 in Memorial Stadium in Baltimore, and the Orioles, I should add, Evan, were so confident they actually had a parade in downtown Baltimore before the series started, and the Mets were not happy about that. You're not supposed to have a parade before the World Series starts. Someone asked Frank Robinson, beforehand, after the Orioles won their playoff series, well, what about how long is the World Series going to last? And he said, well, the Birds of Baltimore haven't decided yet. It may be 4 games, it may be 5 games, but we'll let you know how long it's going to go. I mean, they were big time cocky, and if you looked at, they were one of my favorite anecdotes, Evan, of this whole season with Gil Hodges Jr., Gil's son, who was a high school player in Brooklyn. I mean, talk about a dream summer. I mean, he's like in the dugout in the clubhouse with the Mets the whole season as, I think, a 17-year-old kid. And he's sitting in his father's office before Game 1 of the World Series, and he's looking at the stats of the Mets and the Orioles, and he's looking at these incredible numbers. I mean, the Oriole lineup and the Mets and the Mets not very impressive lineup, and he's going player by player, and he says to him, "Hey, Dad, can I ask you a question?" And Gil Sr. says, "Sure." And he says, "How the hell are you even on the same field with these guys?" And his father, Gil, who was a very powerful, imposing guy, I mean, whose physical presence had the Popeye forearms and just this presence. He gets slowly up from his desk, and he goes over and closes his office door, and he says to his son, I don't ever want to hear you say anything like that again. He said, all that matters is there's a room full of guys out there who believe that they can win this World Series. And that's what I care about, not a bunch of stats on a page. And, maybe the analytics crowd needs to, kind of channel a little Gil Hodges there. I'm joking, but I'm also not joking in a way that there's so, we're so fond these days of parsing numbers and carving things up into a million different ways. But, it's ultimately a game played by human beings. And you can't quantify what belief and confidence means. And the Mets had tremendous faith in themselves, and they didn't care about their numbers. They didn't care that everyone thought they were overmatched. And that all started with the manager.
So the two miracle plays.
Yeah, so the two miracle plays.
Three miracle plays, but go ahead. Yeah.
The Mets lose game one with Tom Seaver on the mound. So right now, everyone's thinking, oh boy, Tom Seaver lost and gave up a home run in the first at-bat to Don Buford. But then in maybe as an important game as the Mets have ever had, Jerry Koosman pitches a brilliant game two in Baltimore. So the series switches to Shea Stadium in game three. And it was there that Tommy Agee probably single-handed incredible running catch in left center, and then another one in right center, both diving, sprawling, catching the ball in the webbing of his glove. And he was a Gold Glove center fielder, but still, considering the circumstances, they're two of absolutely greatest catches in World Series history. Until one game later, when Ron Swoboda, who was not known for his glove, the Mets will tell you, Evan, that nobody in the beginning of the year, Swoboda was such a liability that Hodges would always pull him out of games, late in games, and replace him with Rod Gasper for defensive purposes. But nobody worked harder on his defense than Swoboda that year. He was out there early every day, taking fly balls by the hundreds. And by the end of the year, he was getting the whole game. In game four, at a huge moment, Brooks Robinson hits a line drive into right center. Swoboda's the right fielder, Agee's the center fielder, and it looks for sure that the floodgates are about to open, and Swoboda just makes a headlong dive that was probably imprudent. He would even say, I'm not even sure why I went for it. It would have been probably better to play it safe, keep the ball in front of you, because if it goes by him, Brooks Robinson's not a fast runner, but he at least winds up on third, and he makes his full out sprawl. And I think as great as Agee's catches were, I think Swoboda's catch was even better. And without all of those things, this series, has a completely different result.
Then we have to talk about game 5 too. And I know we're coming up against your time limit here, but we have to talk about the shoe polish play and how that impacts, the Mets are up 3-1 here, thanks to these miracle plays. Frank Robinson gets hit the inning before. And then for whatever reason, another one of these divine moments, there appears to be this wild pitch, but he starts walking to first base. I guess it was Agee, right? Cleon starts walking to first base. And Gil comes walking out with the baseball and goes, "Hey, I don't know what to tell you, but I got some shoe polish here on this baseball." Explain how that happens.
So Cleon, there was a wild pitch, Dave McNally, I believe it was, and he had it bounces it looks to bounce in the dirt, but Cleon starts taking off for first base because it hit him in the foot, and the ump says, "No, that didn't hit you. You're still up at bat." And then, and Cleon Jones is standing there like this ball hit me. And this was, there was not instant review, instant replay, video review, of course, nothing. And the next thing here comes Gil Hodges. He's had his Met jacket on and he had his hands in his pocket. And here comes Gil Hodges coming up the dugout steps. And he's holding a ball in his hand, and he just walks slowly up to the home plate umpire, and he has the ball. And I have to tell you that here's the backdrop on this. Gil Hodges was never, in his entire career as a Brooklyn Dodger, He was never ejected from a game. He was the most, respected, quiet
Even
person.
keel.
Umpires loved him. I mean, the guy he just oozed credibility. I mean, he was like, a son from the heartland who would never lie. You just always could trust Gil Hodges to say and do the right thing. So, I mean, he had this weight, this force of his character that almost poured out of him. So he shows up at home plate with his ball, and he shows it to the ump, and he said, "Look, you see this black smudge on here? That's shoe polish. That's from Cleon's cleat. This ball hit him on the foot. Cleon will tell you." Cleon's right there saying, "Yeah, this ball hit me. This ball hit me." And the umpire looks at it, and then he points Cleon Jones to first base. And Earl Weaver, who was thrown out of the previous game, and he was the anti-Gil Hodges. The Orioles manager was this little pepper pot who was just this profane, a great baseball man, but just a raging nut at times. And he comes racing out of the dugout. And he put his hat, flipped his hat back and basically started screaming and yelling. At the top of the inning, Frank Robinson did get hit by a pitch by Jerry Koosman that they said it didn't hit him. And Koosman tells a story about seeing Frank Robinson in the dugout with his pants open, getting treatment on the wound. And Koosman's on the mound, like just laughing because they didn't give him the first base, even though Koosman hit him with an inside fastball. And then, so the bottom of the inning, now the Mets get the call, and Earl Weaver goes nuts, and Cleon Jones gets first base, and it ends up being, playing a huge part in the outcome of the game. And they have.
But Gil had said, "Hey, rub a little bit of, just do me a favor, rub this on your shoe for a second, and I'll walk it out." Right?
Well, so Gil never. Years later, I mean, no one said anything, but Koosman said he was sitting on the bench near Hodges, and when the ball rolled in the dugout, it came near Koosman, and Koosman said that he took the ball and rubbed it against his shoe and then handed it to Hodges.
Unbelievable.
Now, there are, other Mets who were in the dugout said they never saw that, and Koosman, who's sort of like a good time guy who loves a good story, might be embellishing it for dramatic effect. But, all we know years later is that there was a black smudge on that ball, and Cleon Jones ended up on first base.
So they're there. They're an out away. And Lindsey Nelson says, if they get one more out here, you're going to see one of the gosh darndest sights you've ever seen in sports. There's this fly ball to left. Cleon taps his glove, makes the easy catch. The fans overtake the field. You're apparently one of them who went running out there. Why was that a totally appropriate way for the Mets to celebrate this Miracle World Series, the fans rushing the field?
Well, it had happened. It happened before when the Mets clinched. It happened again when they beat the Braves, and these poor Shea Stadium groundskeepers. I mean, they had to rebuild the field 3 times. It's because it just got, when Met fans went nuts. I mean, there was a degree of hysteria and jubilation like no one had ever seen before. So when and the last hitter for the Orioles ended up, it was fittingly enough in Met history, was Davey Johnson, the second baseman and manager of the '86 Mets. He hits a fly ball to pretty deep left. Cleon gets it, goes down to one knee, and practically before he could close his glove around the ball, I mean, the Barbarians are storming the gates. And I was sitting on the first base side, maybe 15 or 20 rows back with my grandfather. And I was sort of this cautious suburban kid. I'd never think about running on a field, but you know what? There was a tidal wave, and I remember saying, "Gramps, I'm going to do this." And and he just said, "Be careful, son." And I went over. All I wanted to do was like get a little piece of of Shea Stadium sod for the backyard. But it was so crazy, Evan, that one of the bat boys, who was a high school kid from Queens, told me that someone actually a fan tried to rip the uniform off his back. The bat boy. They pulled they got the rubber and home plate out of you can't do that without construction tools.
Right. Right. A hammer and nail, right.
Yeah, I know, they didn't have security checks, but someone either must have bought a shovel or a pickaxe or something to the ballpark that day. But it was, to say the field was like overrun and shredded. It looked like the fall of mankind after about 10 minutes. So it was, and I get my little 2-inch square piece of sod, and I brought it back. I lived in Huntington, Long Island at the time. I brought it back, put it in the backyard, planted it, fertilized it, watered it. We don't live there anymore, so someone's got a piece of Shea Stadium sod in their backyard.
Has there been a baseball miracle since the '69 Mets? I'll give you one that I thought of. Maybe Cal Ripken breaking Gehrig's record. Is that a miracle? Has there been one like that since '69? Well,
I think, Red Sox fans would argue, coming back from 3-0 against the Yankees.
Yeah.
That was certainly epic, and they hadn't won since, Babe Ruth was a Red Sox. And then, Cub fans would have their argument for, but against the context of the times, with the Vietnam War, with society seemingly coming apart at the seams, our way of life seemingly being challenged and turned upside down, against that backdrop and against a team that had never done anything but lose, but that had lost more games from between 62 and 68 than any team in history, to suddenly go from worst to first. I don't think we'll ever see anything like it ever again.
I do want to say a word about your other books. You wrote a book about the 1980 Miracle on Ice team. Why do you like miracles so much?
That book, The Boys of Winter, it actually, really, Evan, when you think about it, it's a pretty similar narrative. In 1980, the U.S. hockey team was going up against the greatest hockey team ever assembled. Just a constellation of all-stars, of many of the greatest players in the history of the sport. And the U.S. team was mostly a bunch of college kids who had played the Soviet team 2 weeks before the Olympics began and lost 10-3 in Madison Square Garden. They had no shot. The Mets almost looked like a favorite compared to those guys. And
so you like miracles
because they had a brilliant coach, and they believed, and they sort of got on a roll, and everything went their way. And it's nice to write about happy events.
Wayne Coffey, author of They Said It Couldn't Be Done, the '69 Mets, New York City, and the most astounding season in baseball history. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Evan.
Well, this was the best possible distraction we could ever have from politics. So certainly check out that book and his others on the Miracle on Ice team. Also the basketball team at Gallaudet University. He's active on Twitter at WR_Coffey and WayneCoffeyAuthor.com. I also want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.